terminal hummed with the usual chorus of announcements, rolling suitcases and weary travelers. It was just another busy morning at LAX, among the crowd. Steven Seagal moved quietly, no sunglasses, no fanfare, just a dark leather jacket, jeans, and a calm presence that somehow commanded attention without trying. He carried a single small duffel and walked with that slow, deliberate confidence that came naturally to him. He approached the gate, handed over his ticket, and offered a polite nod to the attendant. She scanned it without looking up. "First-class boarding's that way," she said flatly, assuming he'd gotten lucky with an upgrade. Steven smiled faintly. "Thank you." Inside the aircraft, the first-class section gleamed with polished seats and murmured conversations. A young flight attendant named Tina stood by the galley, chatting with her coworker. When Steven entered, she barely glanced up, until he placed his bag in the overhead bin. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her tone already edged with impatience. "First class is for premium passengers only." Steven turned unfazed. "I believe that's where I'm seated." She gave a quick, condescending laugh. "Right. Do you have your boarding pass?" Without a word, Steven handed it to her. She looked it over, hesitated for a moment, then handed it back. "Okay, fine. Just making sure. You wouldn't believe how often people wander up here." He gave a courteous nod. "No problem." As he sat down, she muttered under her breath to the other attendant, "Some people really think they're something." A few passengers overheard and exchanged looks. Steven heard it too, but didn't respond. He simply took a deep breath, leaned back, and closed his eyes. Tina rolled her eyes. Must think he's in some kind of movie. The irony of that statement would soon become painfully clear. From across the cabin, a businessman whispered, "That looks like Steven Seagal." But Tina didn't notice or didn't care. The flight crew prepared for takeoff, unaware that this quiet man they'd just mocked wasn't just another traveler. He was someone who could change all their careers with a single phone call. What happened next would leave the entire crew speechless at 30,000 feet. The cabin lights dimmed as the plane taxied toward the runway. Soft murmurs filled the air, the low thrum of engines blending with the distant chatter of passengers. Steven Seagal sat quietly by the window, still as stone, his hands folded loosely in his lap. Years of discipline had carved patience into his nature. He didn't react to rudeness. He absorbed it, observed it, and waited. Tina, the young flight attendant, walked briskly down the aisle, clipboard in hand. Her smile for other passengers was professional, warm, polite. But when she glanced toward Steven, it faded. Something about his calmness seemed to irritate her. As she checked seatbelts, she paused beside him. "Sir, please make sure your seatbelt is properly fastened." "It is," Steven replied evenly. She gave a brief nod but lingered for a moment, her tone edged with mock courtesy. "We have a dress code in first class, sir. Just for future reference." Steven looked at her, not angry, just curious. "A dress code?" "Yes. Most of our premium passengers prefer a more refined atmosphere." He said nothing, just offered a faint, unreadable smile. Tina took his silence as disinterest and walked off, muttering something to the male attendant working beside her. Rick, the other attendant, glanced at her. "You're really going to talk to him like that?" Tina shrugged. "Come on, Rick, look at him. He's either a washed-up actor or one of those YouTube sensei guys. First class is full of fakes these days." Steven heard every word. He looked out the window at the blinking runway lights, unbothered. But the corner of his jaw tightened. The plane began its roll down the tarmac, engines roaring softly as gravity pressed everyone back into their seats. As the nose lifted, the lights flickered. Tina made her rounds, securing trays and closing compartments. When the plane leveled out, she started drink service. Rick pushed the cart down the aisle while Tina handed out warm towels and menus. She smiled at the first few passengers, offering champagne and polite conversation. But when she reached Steven's row, her expression hardened again. "Would you like something to drink?" she asked, the words tight, almost reluctant. "Water, please." She nodded, poured the water, but set it down hard enough for it to splash slightly onto his tray. Steven looked at it, then up at her. His voice was calm, but it carried weight. "Careful. Someone might think you're doing that on purpose." Her face flushed. "Excuse me?" "I said be careful. Accidents happen." The tone wasn't threatening. It was measured, deliberate, and somehow far more unsettling than anger. She forced a nervous laugh, said nothing, and hurried off. Rick followed her back to the galley. "Tina, what's your problem?" "He's being polite," she scoffed. "He's mocking me. Did you see the way he looked at me? Like I'm beneath him." Rick frowned. "He didn't even raise his voice." "Yeah, exactly," she said sharply. "That fake calmness, it's smug." Rick didn't reply. He'd been working flights long enough to recognize when someone was digging their own hole. Back in first class, Steven leaned back, eyes closed. But his awareness was sharp. He could feel tension building like static in the air. A businessman sitting 2 seats away leaned over slightly. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but are you Steven Seagal?" Steven opened his eyes, looked at the man, and nodded once. "Yes, sir," the man smiled. "Didn't want to intrude, but I thought I recognized you." "Big fan, thank you," Steven said, voice soft. "I appreciate that," Tina overheard. She turned, her face momentarily blank. Then she shook her head. "No way," she murmured. "He's not that Steven Seagal." Rick said nothing. He'd seen the man's demeanor, the calm precision, the quiet authority. It was exactly what you'd expect from someone who didn't need to prove anything. The cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. The faint hum of engines filled the silence between glances and whispers. Tina forced herself to look busy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a serious mistake. Steven remained silent, his eyes on the horizon beyond the glass as clouds drifted past in the moonlight. He didn't need to say a word. The real lesson was already beginning to unfold. The first-class cabin glowed softly under dimmed lights. Passengers had settled into quiet conversations, movies flickering on screens or the steady rhythm of typing on laptops. The air was calm, except for the growing tension between Tina and Steven. Tina moved through the aisle again, checking passengers with a polite smile that vanished every time she passed seat 1A. She couldn't stand how composed he remained. No complaints, no reactions. Just that stillness, like he was above everything. When meal service began, she made sure he was the last to be served. "Chicken or beef?" she asked curtly when she finally reached his row. "Chicken's fine," Steven replied. She placed the tray down harder than necessary, silverware rattling against the plate. Rick, standing nearby, shot her a look but said nothing. Steven adjusted the tray slightly, his movements slow, deliberate. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You're welcome," she replied in a tone that carried anything but gratitude. She turned away quickly, annoyed by his calmness as she walked back. 2 passengers whispered, "That's Steven Seagal, right? From the movies?" Tina caught the words and glanced back. A small part of her froze, but she brushed it off. "No, that can't be him," she muttered under her breath. "Just some look-alike trying to act mysterious," Rick sighed. "You really think he'd pretend to be Steven Seagal on purpose?" Tina rolled her eyes. "Please." The real Steven Seagal wouldn't be sitting here alone dressed like that. At that moment, turbulence shook the plane slightly. Passengers tightened their belts as the cabin lights flickered. Tina steadied herself, her irritation rising with the jolt. She noticed Steven sitting motionless, completely unfazed by the shaking. "Sir," she said, her patience thinning. "You need to fasten your seatbelt." "I already have," he replied, showing her the clasp. "Well, make sure it stays that way," she said sharply. A businessman across the aisle frowned. "Ma'am, he didn't do anything wrong," he said. Tina ignored him and walked away, cheeks flushed. Rick leaned toward her. "You're out of line," she glared at him. "You don't get it. He's being smug. He hasn't said a word since boarding, and he's just watching me." "It's weird," Rick lowered his voice. "You're projecting, Tina. You started this." She was about to respond when a passenger from economy class entered the first-class area, clearly confused about seat numbers. Tina jumped at the chance to regain control. "Sir, you can't be here," she said sternly. "This is first class." The man apologized and turned to go back, but Steven quietly stood up. "It's fine," he said. "He's not hurting anyone." Tina spun toward him. "Sir, please sit down. This is none of your concern." Steven's tone was level, measured. Sometimes people just need direction, not humiliation. Her jaw tightened. "I'm the one giving directions on this aircraft." A long silence followed. The businessman from earlier murmured, "Wow." Steven didn't argue. He simply nodded and sat back down. His eyes, however, never left hers. The moment passed, but the mood had shifted completely. Whispers moved through the cabin like ripples on water. People were noticing. Phones were being subtly lifted, cameras discreetly pointed. Tina busied herself with a tray of glasses, her hands trembling slightly. She was frustrated, but beneath that was something new: unease. Rick approached her quietly. "You should stop now. You don't want to end up on someone's phone." She snapped back, whispering harshly, "I'm doing my job." Rick shook his head. "No, you're crossing a line." Tina turned toward Steven's seat one last time. He was gazing out the window, the faint glow of the clouds reflecting on his face. He looked completely at peace, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside her. She wanted him to react, to get angry, to give her something she could justify. But he didn't. He just existed there, calm and composed, as if her words meant nothing. That somehow infuriated her more than anything else. The plane smoothed out again, turbulence fading, but the tension didn't. Everyone could feel it, a quiet standoff between arrogance and composure, pride and restraint. And deep down, Tina began to feel a cold twinge of regret, because for the first time since takeoff, she had the unsettling thought that maybe, just maybe, the man she'd been mocking wasn't an ordinary passenger at all. The flight moved steadily across the clouds, night deepening outside the cabin windows. Most passengers had settled into quiet routines, reading, watching films, or dozing under thin blankets. The faint clinking of glasses and low hum of the engines filled the silence, but for Tina, the air still felt heavy. Every time she walked past seat 1A, she could feel his presence. Not hostile, not angry, just aware. It made her uneasy. She busied herself wiping trays and refilling drinks, trying to shake off the discomfort. Yet out of the corner of her eye, she caught people glancing at Steven more frequently now. His name was beginning to circulate. A young man in his early 20s wearing headphones leaned over from the row behind and whispered to his friend, "Dude, that's Steven Seagal. I'm sure of it." His friend glanced up. "No way, the movie guy? Nah, he's too chill." "I'm telling you," the first replied, sneaking a photo. "Look, same face." "That's him." The soft click of the phone camera wasn't loud, but Tina heard it. She turned sharply. "Sir, no photos allowed on board," she said firmly, walking over. The young man lowered his phone, apologetic. "Sorry, I thought—" Steven looked up, his expression calm. "It's all right," he said gently. "No harm done." Tina froze for a moment, surprised by how relaxed he was. She turned back toward the galley, feeling something she hadn't expected. Guilt. Rick stood there, arms folded, watching her. "He just diffused that for you," he said quietly. Tina didn't answer. As the minutes passed, more whispers began to ripple through first class. Passengers were quietly looking him up on their phones, comparing photos, sharing knowing looks. Then, a woman from across the aisle leaned forward. "Excuse me," she said politely. "I don't mean to intrude, but—" "Are you Steven Seagal?" Steven turned toward her, his gaze steady, his voice low and humble. "Yes, ma'am." "I am." Her eyes widened. "Oh my God, I knew it. My husband loves your movies." She smiled nervously. "I'm sorry if people have been bothering you." He shook his head slightly. "No one's bothering me." The conversation carried softly through the cabin like a quiet shockwave. A few heads turned. Someone else whispered, "He's really him. That's Steven Seagal." Tina stood frozen by the galley wall, her face pale. The realization hit hard. Every dismissive remark, every snide comment, every cold gesture, all directed at someone she should have treated with respect from the start. Rick looked at her, voice low but firm. "Told you," she exhaled shakily, trying to pull herself together. It's fine. I didn't know." "Didn't know," Rick repeated quietly. "Doesn't excuse how you treated him." She glanced back toward Steven. He was helping the woman adjust her overhead bag, moving with quiet grace. No arrogance, no tension, just kindness. The same passengers who had watched the tension earlier now looked at him with admiration. Some even nodded politely when he returned to his seat. Tina wanted to disappear. She straightened her uniform, forced a smile, and walked toward him slowly, tray in hand. "Mr. Seagal," she began awkwardly. I didn't recognize you earlier. I'm sorry if I came across as rude." He looked up, his eyes calm but piercing. "You weren't rude because you didn't recognize me," he said softly. You were rude because you didn't respect me." The words weren't harsh, but they cut through the noise of the plane like a blade. Tina's throat tightened. "I understand," she managed to whisper. He nodded slightly and turned his gaze back to the clouds outside. "Good," he said. "Then you've learned something." Rick stepped forward, quietly taking the tray from her hands to give her a moment to compose herself. The cabin felt different now. The atmosphere that had once been thick with tension was now laced with quiet reflection. Passengers who had stayed silent before were now watching Steven with a kind of respect that went beyond celebrity. He hadn't embarrassed her. He hadn't raised his voice or demanded anything. He simply reminded her and everyone else of the power of dignity. Tina stood still for a long moment, staring at the back of his seat, her heart pounding with the heavy realization of what she'd done. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, clouds glowing faintly under moonlight. Inside, humility had finally begun to replace arrogance. And as the plane cruised silently through the dark sky, one truth had already taken root. Sometimes the quietest people in the room are the ones who could teach you the loudest lessons. The rest of the flight passed in uneasy silence. Tina avoided making eye contact with Steven, though she could feel the weight of her earlier behavior pressing harder with every passing minute. Rick handled most of the service now, moving quietly and efficiently. Steven remained calm throughout. No requests, no complaints. He simply sat there, sometimes resting with his eyes closed, other times watching the clouds drift below the wings. There was nothing theatrical about him, no ego, just stillness. As dawn approached, streaks of gold began to cut through the dark horizon. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and steady. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent into New York. Please fasten your seatbelts." A few passengers stirred awake, stretching and preparing for landing. Tina walked the aisle one last time, checking belts and trays, her usual confidence replaced by an uncomfortable humility. When she reached 1A, she paused. "Seatbelt secure, sir?" she asked quietly. Steven nodded without looking up. "Yes, ma'am." She hesitated as if wanting to say more but couldn't find the words. Finally, she turned away, moving back to her jump seat for landing. The plane touched down smoothly, tires hissing against the tarmac. Passengers applauded softly as the aircraft rolled to a stop. The moment the seatbelt light blinked off, phones lit up. Notifications, photos, whispers. The news of Steven Seagal's presence had spread faster than anyone expected. Rick smiled slightly. "Guess first class just became famous?" Tina forced a faint smile, but anxiety still lingered in her chest. As the passengers began gathering their bags, a man in a dark navy suit appeared at the front of the aircraft. His demeanor was composed but authoritative. He stepped inside, scanning the cabin before his eyes found Steven. "Mr. Seagal," he said warmly. "Welcome back, sir." The voice carried just enough to be heard by the nearest passengers and by Tina, who froze instantly. Steven stood calm as ever. "Morning, John," he greeted, his tone casual but firm. The man, John Miller, Regional Operations Director for the airline, smiled respectfully. "We've arranged a private escort for you to the executive lounge. The board's waiting for you." A hush fell across the cabin. Passengers turned their heads. Tina blinked, her mouth slightly open. "Board," she thought. "What did he just say?" John continued. "Your last meeting about the expansion was a success, sir. They're eager to hear your thoughts on the new international routes." Steven nodded slightly. "Good to hear. Let's handle it quietly this time." Tina's face drained of color. She took a step back, nearly bumping into Rick. "Wait, he's on the board?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Rick gave a low exhale. "No," he said quietly. "I think he owns part of the airline." All at once, everything came crashing down, the sarcasm, the tone, the mockery. Every moment of arrogance now felt like a weight pressing on her chest. Steven gathered his small duffel and turned toward the exit. As he reached Tina, he paused. The aisle fell silent. She opened her mouth to speak, but words failed her. Steven looked at her with the same quiet steadiness he'd shown the entire flight. "We all have bad days," he said softly. "Just don't make someone else live through yours." Her eyes glistened. I'm sorry, Mr. Seagal, I didn't..." He nodded once. "You did," he said without malice. "But you learned. That's enough." And with that, he walked off the plane, followed by the airline director. The moment he stepped into the jet bridge, the entire cabin exhaled. Passengers exchanged astonished looks. A few even applauded softly. Tina stood motionless in the aisle, tears gathering at the edges of her eyes. Rick placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You just got humbled by one of the calmest men on earth," he said quietly. She gave a shaky laugh, halfway between embarrassment and relief. "He could have destroyed me," she whispered. "Yeah," Rick said. "But he didn't. That's the difference." Outside, through the cabin windows, sunlight spilled across the runway. Bright, clean and unforgiving. Tina looked out at it, realizing that the real turbulence of this flight had never come from the sky. It had come from her own pride. The cabin was nearly empty now, the hum of engines replaced by the soft rustle of departing passengers. Tina remained standing near the galley, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her uniform. The adrenaline that had carried her through the confrontation was gone, leaving only guilt and exhaustion in its place. Rick stood beside her, watching ground crew pass by the windows. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Tina nodded, though her voice cracked. "I can't believe that just happened. I treated the owner of the airline like some nobody." Rick sighed. "It's not about who he is. It's about how you treated him before you knew." She swallowed hard. "I know. That's the part that hurts." Before she could say more, John Miller, the same executive who had greeted Steven, stepped back onto the plane. His polished shoes echoed on the floor as he walked toward them. "Tina, Rick," he said calmly. "Mr. Seagal asked me to check in before debrief. He doesn't want this incident blown up or turned into a report." Tina blinked. "He's not filing a complaint?" John shook his head. "No. In fact, he specifically asked that no disciplinary action be taken. He said everyone has something to learn." Her eyes filled with tears again. "He's protecting me." "Yes," John replied, folding his hands. "That's the kind of man he is." Rick smirked faintly. "Guess he really practices what he preaches." John's tone softened. "He also left a message for you, Tina," he said. "Tell her that respect isn't a reward, it's a responsibility." Tina's throat tightened. She turned away, wiping her eyes quickly before anyone could see. "He's right," she whispered. "I've been doing this for years, thinking I could tell who mattered and who didn't the second they walked in." "I was wrong," John nodded. "A lot of people forget that first class isn't about who looks rich, it's about who's human." She exhaled slowly, the reality settling deep into her chest. The glamour of her uniform, the authority she thought she carried. It all suddenly felt paper-thin. After a moment, she looked up at John. "Does he really own the airline?" John smiled. "Major shareholder. One of the founding investors, actually. But he rarely mentions it. He prefers to travel like any other passenger. Says it helps him see how people really are." Tina gave a hollow laugh. "He saw plenty today." "Maybe," John said. "But he also saw something else, that people can change." She took a deep breath. "I need to apologize again." "Properly this time," John nodded. "You'll get the chance. He's waiting in the executive lounge before heading to his meeting." Tina hesitated. Her stomach turned with nerves, but she knew she couldn't walk away without facing him again. Rick nudged her lightly. "Go," he said. "You'll feel better." So she did. The executive lounge was quiet and elegant, filled with morning light and the faint aroma of coffee. Steven sat near the window reviewing a few papers with the calm precision of someone who'd seen the world 1,000 times over. Tina approached slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. "Mr. Seagal?" she said softly. He looked up, offering a small, polite nod. "Miss?" "I wanted to thank you," she began, her voice shaking. "Not just for not reporting me, but for teaching me something I should have learned long ago." He studied her for a moment, then set his papers aside. "Go on." "I thought I was good at reading people," she continued, "but I was really just judging them. I looked at you and assumed. I was wrong. Not because of who you are, but because I forgot that every person deserves respect whether they own the plane or clean it." Steven's expression softened slightly. "You don't owe me an apology," he said, "but you do owe yourself forgiveness. You can't carry the weight of every mistake, and you just have to walk different after them." Her eyes glistened. "I will, I promise." He stood, extending his hand. "Then we're good." She shook it, firm, steady, sincere. As he picked up his briefcase and prepared to leave, he turned back for one final glance. "For what it's worth," he added, "you handled the landing well." Next time, try handling people the same way, steady and smooth. Tina smiled faintly through her tears. Yes, sir. And with that, Steven walked away, calm, composed, and already back to business. Tina stood there in the quiet lounge, watching him disappear down the hall. For the first time in her career, she felt humbled, but also renewed. Because sometimes the people we underestimate the most are the ones who leave us with the lessons we'll never forget. By the next morning, the story had already begun to spread, though Steven himself hadn't said a single word publicly. It started with a passenger's social media post, a blurry photo of Steven sitting quietly in first class. With the caption, "Flight attendant mocked him for looking out of place." Turns out, he owns the airline. Within hours, it was everywhere. News blogs, travel pages, even entertainment outlets picked it up. Hashtags began trending across platforms. Respect everyone, Steven Seagal story, class and calm. Tina woke up to dozens of messages from coworkers and friends. Some were supportive, others were curious, even shocked. She didn't reply to any of them. She just sat on the edge of her bed staring at the screen, replaying every second of that flight in her mind. Meanwhile, in the corporate offices of Silverjet Airlines, executives gathered for their regular operations meeting. Steven arrived quietly, dressed in a simple black suit, his demeanor as steady as ever. John Miller greeted him with a warm smile. "Quite a stir on the internet, sir," he said. Steven chuckled softly. "I noticed." One of the board members, an older man with glasses, frowned. "Should we issue a statement denying or confirming your involvement?" "The story's already gone viral." Steven shook his head. "Let the story live." "It's not about me. It's about behavior." The room fell silent. He continued, his tone calm but resolute. "We run an airline that carries people from every walk of life. Rich, poor, famous, unknown. The moment our staff forget that respect isn't selective, we stop being a service and start being a hierarchy." The board nodded in agreement. John leaned forward. "She's been deeply affected, sir. Tina called me this morning asking if she could speak to the entire cabin crew about what she learned. She wants to apologize publicly, not because she was told to, but because she wants to." Steven smiled faintly. "Then let her. That's how people grow." 2 days later, Tina stood in the crew lounge, addressing over 50 staff members. Her uniform was crisp, but her voice trembled slightly as she began. "I made a mistake," she admitted openly. "I let my assumptions decide how I treated someone. And I was wrong, painfully wrong. What I learned from that experience is simple. Respect is not earned by status. It's given by choice." The room was quiet. Even the most seasoned attendants listened closely. "I mocked a man I thought was beneath the standards of first class," she continued. "But that man reminded me that class isn't in a seat. It's in your attitude." There was a long pause before someone started clapping. Soon the whole room joined in. At the back of the lounge, Steven stood quietly, listening. He hadn't announced his presence. When the applause faded, he stepped forward just enough for her to see him. Their eyes met, and Tina's breath caught. He gave her a respectful nod. "Well said," he said simply. She smiled, tears glistening. "Thank you, sir, for giving me a second chance." "You gave it to yourself," he replied. He turned to the rest of the staff. "Every person who boards our planes carries a story. Don't be the reason it turns bitter. Be the reason they remember kindness." The room was silent again, filled with the kind of quiet respect that words rarely earn. Later that week, international media picked up the story. Talk shows discussed it. Commentators praised Steven's restraint and grace. Passengers shared their own stories of being misjudged or mistreated. One news anchor summed it up best. Steven Seagal didn't humiliate the person who disrespected him. He humbled her with compassion and reminded us that true power is silent. Meanwhile, Steven avoided interviews. When a reporter caught up to him outside a charity event, asking if the viral story was true, he only said, "Let's just say everyone should fly with respect, in the air or on the ground." And that was all. Weeks later, Tina worked another early morning flight. As she served coffee to a passenger in 1A, she smiled warmly, her voice calm and genuine. "Good morning, sir. Welcome aboard," she said. The passenger smiled back. "Thanks, you've got great energy today." She nodded. "Every day's a chance to do better." As she walked away, she caught a glimpse of a small card tucked behind the galley panel. one that hadn't been there before. It read in neat handwriting, "Respect isn't about who deserves it. It's about who you are when no one's watching." Tina smiled, touched the card gently, and returned to her work, lighter, wiser, and more grounded than ever. Because in the end, the flight she thought would ruin her had instead taught her how to soar.